I do want to begin actually with my connection to Paul Bernard. There was many things that everyone in this room knows about his work, but what has touched me the most is that he was part of the data liberation movement and the creation of the research data centers. And these are two papers that I published in the last few months that come from the research data centers, from the Canadian Community Health Survey and from the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth. And my life and my research has been much richer because of his contributions to all of us that can get access to these exquisite data. So merci à Paul Bernard. I want to deal with food insecurity as an intractable policy problem. I think the translation is in politiques tenaces. And I want to talk to you about policy framing analysis. I will give you 4 examples. This is much a work in progress from our new research grant, but I think it'll give you a sense of why this may be important work. So the definition that we use in our research program is that food insecurity is inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. Often the definition is with this, that food security is this, people at all times having access to socially acceptable, etc. And I do not believe at all that the opposite of food security is food insecurity. I think food insecurity is specific to the lack of access to food because of financial constraints. And so that's the framing of the definition that I will use. Food insecurity is an intractable policy problem. That means that we have been able to measure now quite effectively since 2004, 2005, using the same measurement tool. We're not seeing anything but small decreases and then post-recession increases. We are not seeing, if anything, we're going in the wrong direction. And so the conceptual framework is that this intractable policy problem may be because we understand it very differently, and therefore we apply our solutions with different frames. So just a very highlights on food insecurity for those that are not familiar with the data. So these are the 2011 Canadian Community Health Survey, where we actually do have a standardized measure of household food insecurity. And here you see that the more modern nomenclature is to talk about food insecurity as having marginal, moderate, and severe. And we've been pushing this concept of marginal because those that are in the marginal, these are individuals who only answer one question out of that module, but they are the ones that usually answer the question around anxiety about running out of food, worry about food. And they actually perform very strongly in the same gradient of health that we see with the rest of food insecurity. Moderate food insecurity is usually those that have a compromise in the quality of the food. And severe food insecurity is the more classical concepts of skipping meals, not eating for a whole day, more akin to hunger. So the data for 2011 is that we have about 13% of our households, and it's measured as a household phenomenon. That's where you get these numbers of 4 million, etc., Canadians. So it's actually a large problem. Many times people think it's too large a problem to actually be a problem. And then when I say, well, look at the severe food insecurity, 2.5 of our percent of our population, well, that's too small a problem. So it's one of the first dilemmas. So this is just a very quick way of demonstrating that food insecurity is very much related to household income. And this is again just plotting Canadian Community Health Survey data. Food insecure is your straight line, and then the dashed line is food. Food secure is this straight line, and the dashed line is food insecure. And you can see that you have this very much reduction of food insecurity when you start to increase income. But you also see one of the controversies is that all of the poor are not food insecure, and not all those who are not poor are food secure. So remember that one as we come forward, because it is one of the first ways that we consider this to be a bit of a complicated issue, which is a framing in itself. Very quickly then, when you look at a very large body of epidemiology suggests what drives food insecurity, both in terms of populations that are vulnerable, but in terms of what can drive the prevalence up or down. Low income is very important, as I've shown you, but income shock, so that would be somebody losing their job, somebody in the chômage, having a child is usually an income shock. Sometimes recession and those types of issues become a broad shock. Another major driver of food insecurity is that while workforce participation and education are protecting you, we do have problems in our labor market, and one of the papers I showed you was food insecurity in the Canadian labor market. The perverse effect where we have the pink collar ghetto, for example, which is the secretarial ghetto. There's far more food insecurity in that industrial sector than there should be for the education of those that are employed. The other group is that given African Canadian background, there's far more food insecurity when you correct for education and other things, and there should be for the level of education among those workers. So it shows that we have a racialized workforce. So we have the many aspects of our labor market can perpetuate food insecurity, which is why we have the phenomenon of the majority of food insecure are hardworking families. The majority even of people who are attending a food bank come from the employment sector, the low-wage sector. And then finally, things that a group in a Département de santé publique would know is that the structural determinants leave certain groups vulnerable. So we can predict who will be vulnerable on the basis of systemic problems. So the policies that would be linking to those kind of major drivers of food insecurity would be the income supports, the social assistance, for example, and employment insurance. Protecting income volatility. There isn't actually the same protection from income volatility. In fact, payday loans is actually what's in the market to protect against income volatility. When you don't have money, you borrow from a payday loan until you get past that little bit of up and down. In contrast, homeowners have income volatility. They can draw on a line of credit. So that's one of their protections. Labor protection should be there. I work in Bangladesh. I know the International Labor Organization has dictated that low-income workers should be paid twice a month. Trying to get the garment workers in Bangladesh paid twice a month is impossible. Low-income workers in Canada should be paid twice a month. That kind of labor protection as a minimum is required in order to reduce food insecurity. There are other social protection and transfers, so we recognize very much that the child poverty rates in Nordic countries would be very much higher had there not been social transfers and social protection. Quebec has always been a model of social protection, and my atelier yesterday shows some alarming retraction on some of the social protections. And getting access to higher education. Definitely the école secondaire is very important, but higher access as well is very important. So these are the drivers of food insecurity, and these are the linked policies. However, what are the dominant responses in the name of food insecurity? Not only in Quebec, but across country. Food banks, les banques alimentaires, that's the dominant response. In fact, the valence, the understanding, the resonance of the word food bank, everyone understands food banks equals food insecurity. In fact, people don't even know food insecurity, they know food banks. Food banks are the dominant response. Community gardens, farmers markets, the school food programs, sometimes breakfast and lunch, community kitchens, community sport agriculture, and all types of food system work. Those are the dominant responses to food insecurity that we see, and many people here that are listening to this talk come from those dominant responses. And so we're going to interrogate that. You can't see that I'm linking them to the actual problem, which is what my point is. So proof, we had to get an acronym. It was developed well after we got the grant, is a $2 million programmatic grant from the CIHR to address here research to identify policy options to reduce food insecurity. It's led by Valerie Tarsek at University of Toronto and Craig Gunderson, very well-known researcher in food insecurity at the University of Illinois. I'm talking about the theme of policy options in terms of the food insecurity as an intractable problem that I do with Catherine Ma out of the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. So I'm going to be talking about our new program of research that is trying to tackle the issue of the intractable problem of policy related to food insecurity. So I think that these might also be the objectives, but they are key frames that we begin our discussion with. Food insecurity is a population health problem. Okay, here you're here is a problem of the public's health and well-being. When you have a population problem, you should have a policy solution. And policy solutions arrive from an intervention theory of what should work, this is how it will work, and how can I persuade you to make it work. So you're going to begin with that kind of a premise that we have a problem at the population level that needs a policy intervention. There are many theories of policy intervention, and in the dominant public health choice of policy intervention theory is that of Sabatier and advocacy coalitions. And Quebec is very replete with very strong examples of the policy coalition working together with partnership, mobilizing voice, consensus-based. The theory that we ascribe to, and I'm happy to take questions as I get every time, about why we use the kingdom theory, John Kingdom's theory, also called multiple streams theory, which is also not unknown to public health, is because we think that the foundation of policy action is on the definition of the problem. So very briefly, this theory suggests that there are problems, there are policies, and then there's a politique. And it doesn't translate as well because you've got politique. So, but the issue is we begin with our understanding of the policy problem. We then propose a variety of policy options, solutions, and then we need the politics to actually make them real. What connects these three very siloed analyses in policy analysis is these windows of opportunity. Okay, in between there are the policy windows, les fenêtres d'opportunité. And what opens a window is often the policy entrepreneur. So they are trying to navigate, the policy influencers, the policy entrepreneurs, they try to navigate with their policy understanding of what needs to be done, waiting for these windows. So I hope he's not here to embarrass him, but I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with someone working in occupational health on an unregulated agencies. And do we need a worker death to have a policy window to say it's time to regulate? Right? So we navigate as policy entrepreneurs, waiting for those opportunities. And sometimes there are official windows like elections. Sometimes there's, you know, in Nova Scotia, the most profound change was when Randy and his wife, the first sort of hemophiliacs that got HIV, went to see the Minister of Health and said, who did this to my family, right? And so that changed completely the understanding of the precautionary principle and how we would be regulating our blood supply. So that's the theory that I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be spending my time on the problematization. Now, Susan Stone talks about, we may all actually understand a concept, but then when we try to play it out as a problem, we have a different understanding. So, an elementary school class, the teacher has a cake, and the children understand that they want to distribute the cake equitably. And then the policy dilemma comes. Well, what do you mean? Does that mean that everyone gets the same slice? What happens about the children that are not here today? What about the children who don't like cake? Do they get the same as those who do like cake? Should we have a lottery so that one person gets the cake? Should the students decide who gets the cake and how the cake will be distributed? Or is it the teacher that will be considering it? So even in the name of something as simple as let's be equitable about distribution of this cake and what we do with this cake, you get into a very, very complex understanding of what is equitability and how shall it be demonstrated and who is responsible for it. So it's just one of the examples to show how important it is to reconsider problematization. So this is where we come into the concept of framing. And for those that were there yesterday, it's really not formulation. I heard later it was more encadrage, to frame. So this is the concept I want you to bring away today. That framing is the way of defining a problem. Framing is selective. It rules in and it rules out, okay, by definition. That each frame suggests a different causal pathway and proposes different actors and valid policy participants. So the framing is the most essential component in that whole pathway around policy action. So there's how it fits, again, as a key component. So our research begins with a framing analysis. The framing analysis asks the blue, what is the problem and how is it defined? That's the central concept. What is very important and what is often overlooked is what policy actors are implicated and how are they assigned responsibility. And it was a conversation again this morning that raised this again, is that in public health we have a reasoning that talks about risk and epidemiology. We never assign blame. But policy analysis must assign blame or responsibility. And in fact, we are so knowing of that, but we avoid it, is that that's what we call they. And I don't know if it translates, but they, who's they? Who's they? That's what we talk about, somebody, they. That's not what you can do in policy framing. You need to be able to know your actors, who is responsible, who is to be blamed, okay? So then, when you have an analysis, you have to then have the links are obvious on what the solutions would be to solve that problem. There are many other references to framing analysis, and they're just there as a background. So I'm going to give you some examples of framing that we've been starting to explore. So this is actually way that we wanted to actually introduce our framing, is to actually look at Canada's response to the 1996 World Food Summit. And I will give you a high level. So very interesting, the World Food Summit was profound in terms of the right to food. The definition of food security was expressed at that time. I think, let's say 112 countries signed on, including Canada. And the obligation after the World Food Summit was for countries to report on their progress towards the right to food. So we were able to look at the reports that were given between 1999 to 2008. The progress report produced by the federal government, the Government of Canada. And again, this is that's the public policy domain. This is the federal government report on its international obligations, right? So it has a huge credibility. Just for your interest, you'll see that there was obviously some change in government over that time period. And so what we were able to do is to look at the framing of the problem of food insecurity and the framing of the actions. There was an action plan as the reports progressed. We found out totally off the record that there are no more reports that will be produced because they were useless, etc. So this is our entire sum. So what did we find in an overview, just to give you a sense on how important this is? And I'll take you forward to say that De Schutter, the special rapporteur on the right to food, came to Canada just over, I think, a year ago. And there was a huge upset because the Minister of Health, would refuse to meet him. Why was he in this country? He had no business being in this country. And what we were able to presage is that we could have predicted that because of the change in framing. So the first thing we found in terms of these reports was what we call a frame shift. Reports 1 to 3 absolutely began with Canada's commitment to the right to food. Report number 3 said that the WHO had recognized Canada as an exemplar country of the OECD for its progress on the right to food. I can just remember, go back, we have the Liberals. We go to the next party, the right to food disappears in reports 4 and 5. It's completely eliminated, which is why it would be a great surprise and a great insult to have the rapporteur on the right to food come to our country in that period of time as opposed to before. The second thing is that food insecurity, those who are vulnerable, in the first 3 reports, talked about people with health problems being vulnerable to food insecurity. On the 4th and 5th report, it was that the chronic disease was caused by food insecurity. Okay? And so we changed our entire discourse into why we need to work on healthy eating, around the food insecure. We get into our fruits and vegetables needed for the food insecure, whereas before it was just a categorization of risk. So there's a real shift in the importance. Before it was thought to be, these are one of the predictors of people falling into the income inadequacy of food insecurity because they have health problems, they can't work. But all of a sudden it's shifted by the 4th and 5th that their chronic disease, because they can't eat well, is a really important issue, and therefore we end up with a new set of frames of what we need to do. Give them fruits and vegetables, teach them cooking from scratch, okay? Another way that the frame changed is the frame blending. And this is very important. So the first reports were very clear that low income was the greatest impediment to food insecurity. As we move forward, we end up suggesting, as I showed you, not all the poor are food insecure, not all the food insecure are poor. So it becomes one of many factors. These other factors are not understood. Okay? And all of a sudden it's equal to all these other factors that are not understood. And therefore it becomes a complicated issue. And today we think of it as a complicated issue. It was not complicated in the first 3 reports. It becomes complicated, particularly when it competes against not clearly understood. Okay? So what happens over that time is that these interventions that are recommended, the interventions that are heralded, like the National Child Benefit was called #1 food insecurity, these big social transfers that were all part of the early times, they're gone when it comes to 4 and 5, and we de-emphasize it. And all of a sudden we see community gardens and other types of approaches as being part of the interventions for this very complex problem. Finally, within frame conflict, every year they were saying we lacked sufficient information, and we can't really know what to do. And then they started monitoring things that were very derivative. Yes, they monitor the hunger count, but then they would monitor the number of community garden programs, and obviously this monitoring of all these things as a conflict to saying, well, we don't have any good numbers. So again, just as an example of a framing exercise and how it can work to be very much informing why we do what we do and why we don't do perhaps what we should do. So what we would contend from this analysis is that when the UN envoy arrived, he was obviously going to be discredited because he had no business being in our country. But then talk about complicated framing, his 2 reports, one was preliminary, one was final, I believe for the United Nations envoy on the right to food, look at his chapters. They are a bit confusing. One was on agricultural policies. The one that is on food insecurity is really the one on protecting access to food for the poorest, where he does talk about the key things that would reduce poverty. But he has his own obesity chapter, in the name of food adequacy, talk about conflated, and then something about the indigenous peoples and other things. So even the spokesperson for the right to food, that as a basic essential need, has been captured at least by the obesity framing. Another example then is one of our key questions is how is household food insecurity defined and socially constructed as a policy problem in Canada? And so this is a very large body of work that we are still in the process of analyzing. And here again, the public record is most presented in the public debates, Hansards, which is the transcription of the parliamentary discussions both in provincial legislatures and in the federal. And we also are looking at the committees that come from the Senate and the House of Commons. So these are all in the public record. What we did is look at, again, with World Food Summit being our benchmark year, we looked at the Hansards and these key documents in Nova Scotia, in British Columbia, in Ontario, and federally. And je dirais vraiment pas Québec, because with your social exclusion law, it would have been nice to see the rhetoric that led to it. So it's another project. And so what I'm going to, so it's being done as a policy analysis, and so I'm just going to share you some of the examples. Even my students, not that they shouldn't be like that, but even my undergraduate students were horrified at reading the transcripts from Ontario around the dirty years of Harris. So Mike Harris was made famous across the legislatures of the country, by the way. He was quoted, everyone wanted to avoid Harris, the Harris experience in their provinces. So we read in these transcripts the closest we've ever had to a created depression, and the depression type of conversations that you would have expected during the dirty 30s when people were in soup lines. So we wanted to know if that's our most recent experience with really creating that very, very, very dire poverty, what did it sound like, how was it framed, and what happened? So this is the period 1995 to 2002. It was a very charged socio-political environment. What we did is look at our Hansards there, but also look at the editorials in the major newspapers just to see how the policy debates, if they were the same or if they were different in that. So it was the intention to say, is it because we've got this crazy framing now because it's not really that serious? Personne affamée, you know, is that why? So we thought if we go close to a time when it was very, very, people were really hungry, what does it sound like in that debate? And also, public health was there. And how did they react when there were really deep calls for like a complete overhaul or reform? So this is more of a visual way of presenting the problem. So what was seen and discussed was that people were going to food banks who really shouldn't be there. There were seniors going to food banks. There were families, hardworking families. There were children that were affected. There were people that were working. That there was something wrong because people who really shouldn't be at food banks were food insecure. This was a time as well where they said, you know what, there's actually this child hunger, and the rhetoric of the day was children are hungry, children are hungry, children are hungry, right? Just because people were very, very, very anxious and they wanted to make their point. And so there was also, well, the children are poor, but their families are poor, so there was a discussion around child poverty. And this whole problem turned into a crisis as it really deepened. So this is sort of the frame of the problem. I hope you can see this. If that's the frame of the problem, there were a variety of solutions that were explanatory about why this had happened and what needed to be done. And just because I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to point out that public health, in its rhetoric, adopted certain solutions, while other solutions it never had a comment on. So there were two schools of thought in the policy debates about why hardworking families were resorting to the food bank. Why our veterans were forced back into poverty. So the one was that it was the previous government had completely misspent and they're trying to, fix it. And others were that this was a very mean-spirited government, right? So there were kind of two major ways that people were sort of arguing for this to be turned around. The first was we needed a good government. We needed a government that considers solidarity, that considers basic needs, that cares for its people, and that we had lost that way structurally. On the other hand, there was another call that said what we need to do is we need everybody to take care of their neighbors. We need to work as community. We need, to do the call out for people caring about each other, because people are really suffering. The other thing that happened in that kind of analysis is it became very clear there was advocacy around getting those people who shouldn't be there out of the food banks, out of that poverty, at the same time understanding that there were the poor that would always be with us. Okay? That there was a lot of energy towards getting the ones who shouldn't be there out, knowing that there would have to be something for those that are left behind, that are always going to be with us. So it's split. We could call it deserving versus undeserving. You could call it, the notion of the proximal, the near poverty, the new impoverished. But it split the activities. And it forever, we would suggest, entrenched this very lowest group at the bottom, the poorest of the poor. And they were to be managed by the welfare system and by food banks. And then we could use our other capacities to work on those who shouldn't be there. So you'll notice that public health at this time decided to throw its lot in with the individual community members, the goodwill, the caring for each other, volunteers, good civil society organizations, looking at community gardens, community breakfast programs, the appropriate food, looking at encouraging, volunteerism and having community food programs. What public health did at that time is they did not say a word around structural reform, inequity, the revolution. They did not say anything about welfare reform. They did not say anything about a minimum wage, guaranteed annual income. They left the anti-poverty screamers to do that structuralness, and they went happily ever after into the way that they could help those who really shouldn't be there, and with all this wonderful sort of community capacity growing. So we felt it was really a lost opportunity for public health in the most grave, structurally created, attack against the poor. It framed its way out in terms of the good neighbors and what people could do. And so it may actually represent today the work that public health does in food insecurity. So our key findings is that this is a historical case for examining the two divergent frames on household food insecurity, ones that had more food community-based analyses and the other that was really on the income base, the kind of absolute fundamental structural reforms. And it was, in our mind, a lost opportunity for critical mobilization around structural determinants. The response of public health during this era could explain, as I've mentioned, why we are where we are with this very much sympathy for the community response and not so much energy for the income-based response. So the food bank is the absolute iconic understanding of food insecurity in Canada. Right, left, or green, we understand what food banks are. We also understand that it's not good for people to have to go to food banks. We don't say that food banks are bad, we just say it's not good for people to go to food banks. And so just as another framing device, we did begin with Janet Poppendick's very famous interrogation of food banks. And she called it the 7 Deadly Inns, and it's very contemporary to the World Food Summit. And in those days, in this sort of ethnographic work, there was always a struggle of insufficient food and the inappropriateness and whether or not there was stable supply, if food banks were accessible, whether or not they created stigma and indignity. And when we looked at the critical literature on food banks since then, it's very much in that domain, though a few new inns have appeared. So one of the common discourses you're hearing from Elaine Power and myself and perhaps others is that food banks render the problem invisible, that people are shunted off there so their hunger cries are not heard on the streets. that there's an invalidation of entitlements, that the state, in fact, should be providing basic needs, and instead we have this thing that actually says we don't need to give you your entitlements as a citizen because we have this charitable mechanism. They're institutionalized and they're ineffective even by definition, because going to a food bank is a socially unacceptable way to receive food. You are always food insecure by definition. So what we did in our interrogation of the more critical literature on food banks over the time period is we looked at what kind of recommendations came out of international food bank researchers. And we found that there was one frame, no matter what your research was, the outcome was we need to build better food banks. We say that much nicer. We need to have some cooking classes, we need some bok choy, we need to get better fruits and vegetables, we need to distribute it differently than just everybody coming there so we can have multiple food banks, but they're all building a better food bank. The other group is the anti-poverty group that says we need income, we need income, we need income as the first step. But when they write their recommendations on policy advocacy, they all sound identical, which is why you would expect, as a policymaker, it's 2 o'clock, the people come in, they lobby the policymaker to increase funding to food banks or like organizations because we've got such a serious problem. And then 30 minutes later, food bank researchers come in and they say we need to fight this welfare retrenchment, we need to index our welfare rates, we need to get a fair living wage. So you can see that the exact same modalities are being used to influence policy. And you could see why the frames are creating the intractable policy problem. The ins, you see, are related. So the groups that are insufficiency, inadequate, instability are the ones that want to build a better food bank, and then those that are actually decrying inequality, etc. On the same basis of food banks are a very serious marker of a problem, are wanting to do the other. So one of the reasons we think there is intractable policy in this area is because of the exact same research methodology and the advocacy strategies giving very different ideas to policymakers. So the fundamental problem that comes out of this is that food banks, the use of food banks is a problem. Nobody would disagree on that problem, but what we frame as the solution is to build a better food bank. And so that's actually a huge action path that's going on in Canada today. And I have to read this very quickly because it's the ultimate expression of the frame of building a better food bank, and it comes from a British Columbia Hansard. Watching the faces of the families and children lining up for food at the door, she saw how undignified receiving emergency food hampers was for the people who needed to be there. So it was time to change the way the food bank regarded clients. From then on, clients were the food bank's most valuable resource, to be treated as potential volunteers, future workers and supporters, changing its name to reflect what it wanted to achieve, food action plans and food security in our community. And if you ever see the television interview with food bank volunteers, the favorite volunteer used to be a recipient. This is a very effective framing strategy. My final example is very quick. Just a basic description is when you read these Hansards over and over again, what are we hearing about how food insecurity is framed as a policy problem? It's really framed on who experiences it. They're called the poor, the vulnerable but honest folks, children, hardworking citizens, and then surprising and not surprising is my favorite. So it's not surprising that we have people going up to the food bank when we've cut our rent controls, but it's so surprising that we have the highest number of food bank attendees than we've ever seen. So surprising, not surprising is one of the more common frames. What is absent in the frames, for those of us that are believing in the determinants of health, is there is never a frame of asking why. Never a frame, that the absent frame is why, who's responsible. Okay, the opposition always calls it reckless government on the other side, but that's not exactly the same level of responsibility that would have precision. So there is nobody that actually in the public discourse asks the difficult questions and asks the determinants question, the root cause. This is the kind of frame, so I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one of the biggest frames, of course, is that food insecurity is a problem and food is what needed. And I've given you sort of a repetitive sense that the notion of food is the problem, food is the solution for food insecurity is an entire framing which one could disagree with, right? So there's hunger and merit because people don't have money to access food. They can't produce it, gather it. They need to be able to learn how to cook and preserve their food, etc. You can see how you can get very diluted in this quote from the basic first sentence, which is they don't have enough money. And then we're going to give them capacity to grow their own, to freeze it, to etc. Much of the discourse is that food insecurity is an exemplar, and I use it as a lens of dynamic poverty, a lens of deep poverty, a lens of reproducible, sort of vulnerability. And so an example would be that, that it's an admission of failure, utter failure of the social safety net, the fact that the basic personal allowance, is not enough to feed people, so it's an acknowledgement of failure. So again, this exemplar concept is really helpful, but some people forget when they listen that they think it's the problem as opposed to the example of the problem. The hungry child was meant to be an exemplar of the most profound poverty, and it got confused with feeding children in breakfast programs. Sometimes you've got a frame that's very action-based. We need to look at minimum wage, we need to look at social assistance rates, etc. Okay, so that's saying that these are structural problems that require structural changes. And then you have the other interrogation, which is the dominant, is that many people who are currently accessing food banks and other handout type programs would much rather be providing for themselves, but lack the skills, training, or knowledge to succeed. Support for community-based projects which encourage self-sufficiency and increase self-confidence among participants is crucial. Here the frame is that individual capacity is required, collective will can support that individual capacity, and the root of this is personal action. So it's not a structural analysis at all, but it is a dominant response. So my final thoughts is that food insecurity may be an intractable policy problem in Canada because our policy actors are at an impasse on how to address it, given that they frame it differently, divergently. And I'll totally renounce my title, so in contradiction to my title, which says when getting the problem wrong leads to faulty solutions, there's actually no right or wrong here, right? I mean, nobody's on the side of the angels, and public health often has to remember that. But different frames suggest different causal pathways for how food insecurity works in households, which may be more or less valid, more or less likely to do a serious reduction in food insecurity. And so finally, my final thought is that if we need to resolve the framing problem in order to move policies forward, that will better address food insecurity in Canada. Right now, we are unable to do so. Merci et les questions.